Morning sun cast a golden hue over downtown Atlanta, but inside the Fulton County Courthouse, the air was heavy with expectation. Reporters and camera crews clustered outside, eager to cover one of the most high-profile trials of the year, the case of Brandon Cole, a millionaire real estate tycoon accused of fraud, corruption, and endangering the lives of his employees. Despite the severity of the charges, Brandon walked into the courthouse as if he owned the place. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, a Rolex glinting on his wrist, and dark sunglasses shielding his eyes, he exuded the same cocky confidence that had helped him rise to the top. As he strutted through the metal detectors, he ignored the murmurs of the bystanders, the workers who had lost their jobs because of his greed, and the journalists hurling questions his way. To him, they were nothing more than background noise in his unshakable world of privilege. At his side was Gerald Whitmore, his high-profile defense attorney who had gotten dozens of wealthy clients off the hook. Whitmore adjusted his tie, his voice low and controlled. "Brandon, let's make this clear. This judge isn't like the others. He won't be impressed by money or status. We need to play this smart." Brandon smirked, shoving his sunglasses into his pocket. "Come on, Gerald. You think I'm actually worried about this? It's a show trial. I'll be out by noon." Gerald exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated. "Brandon, listen to me. Judge Marcus Bennett is known for being tough on corporate crime. If you don't show respect in that courtroom—" Brandon waved him off. "I don't show respect. I command it." Whitmore shook his head but said nothing more as they entered the packed courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Rows of spectators filled the seats, including former employees of Cole Industries, many of whom had been injured due to unsafe working conditions. Among them was Leonard Tate, a man in his 50s who had suffered a severe back injury after a scaffolding collapse on one of Brandon's construction sites. At the prosecution table sat Jessica Owens, the sharp-witted assistant district attorney, her gaze focused and unwavering. Unlike Whitmore, she wasn't nervous. She was ready for this fight. Then the courtroom doors opened once more, and Judge Marcus Bennett entered. A tall, imposing black man in his early 50s, he carried himself with measured authority. The entire courtroom stood, a sign of respect for the judge, except for one person. Brandon remained seated, leaning back in his chair, arms casually draped over the armrests. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom, with some jurors exchanging startled glances. Judge Bennett stopped mid-step, his sharp eyes locking onto Brandon. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice calm but carrying undeniable weight. "Perhaps you are unfamiliar with court protocol. In this courtroom, when I enter, everyone stands." Brandon smirked, not even bothering to hide his disdain. "Well, Judge, I don't make it a habit to stand for people I don't respect." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even Whitmore looked momentarily stunned, his grip tightening around his pen. Jessica Owens's lips curled into the faintest smirk. She didn't need to say anything. Brandon had just dug his own grave. Judge Bennett remained composed, but a flicker of something dangerous flashed in his eyes. He stepped up to his bench, adjusting his robe before speaking again. "Noted," he said simply, his tone unreadable. Then he gavelled the session into order. Brandon barely concealed his grin. He thought he had just asserted dominance, that he had rattled the judge. He had no idea how wrong he was. The tension in the courtroom remained palpable as Judge Bennett took his seat at the bench. Every pair of eyes in the room flickered between him and Brandon, waiting for the judge's next move. But instead of reacting to Brandon's blatant disrespect, Bennett simply opened a file, adjusted his glasses, and proceeded with court formalities as if nothing had happened. "Prosecution, are you ready to present your case?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Jessica Owens stood, her blazer crisp, her expression sharp as a blade. "Yes, Your Honor. The state is prepared to proceed." She turned toward the jury, pausing for dramatic effect before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because of one simple truth. Brandon Cole believes he is untouchable. He believes that his wealth and power place him above the law. But today we prove that no one, not even a man with millions in his bank account, is above justice." Brandon scoffed loudly, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe this spectacle. Jessica's gaze flicked to him briefly, then back to the jury. She wasn't rattled. If anything, his arrogance played right into her hands. She continued, pacing slowly before the jury box. The evidence will show that Mr. Cole knowingly engaged in fraudulent business practices, putting profit over people. He cut corners on safety measures, resulting in multiple injuries on his construction sites. He manipulated financial records, defrauding investors and employees alike, and he did it all because he believed, without a doubt, that he would never face consequences. She let her words hang in the air. The jury members were listening intently, some taking notes. Brandon leaned toward Whitmore, his voice a low whisper. "You're going to tear her apart, right? Make this whole thing look ridiculous?" Whitmore pinched the bridge of his nose. "Brandon, for once, just keep your mouth shut." The defense attorney stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, while the prosecution is eager to paint my client as some kind of corporate villain, the reality is far less dramatic. Brandon Cole is a businessman, not a criminal. He has created jobs, revitalized communities, and contributed to this city's economy. The state is attempting to criminalize success, and we will prove that Mr. Cole acted within the bounds of the law." A few murmurs echoed in the courtroom. Brandon smirked, satisfied with Whitmore's argument. But Jessica Owens didn't look fazed. Judge Bennett nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed with opening testimonies." The prosecution's first witness was Leonard Tate, the former construction worker who had suffered a life-altering injury due to Brandon's negligence. He walked with a cane, his posture stiff as he took the stand. Jessica Owens approached him with careful respect. "Mr. Tate, can you tell the court how you came to work for Cole Industries?" Leonard nodded. "I was hired as a site supervisor for one of Mr. Cole's projects downtown. I'd been in construction for 20 years, so I knew what I was doing. But I also knew when something wasn't safe." "And did you notice unsafe conditions on Mr. Cole's sites?" Leonard exhaled slowly, gripping his cane. "Yes, time and time again. We raised concerns about faulty scaffolding, weak foundation materials, and rushed deadlines. But every time we brought it up, we were told to get it done or risk losing our jobs." "Who told you that?" Leonard's gaze flickered to Brandon, his jaw tightening. "His supervisors, his managers, and they all got their orders from him." Jessica nodded, stepping closer. "Can you tell the court what happened on the day of your accident?" Leonard swallowed hard. "We were working on the 4th floor of a high-rise. The scaffolding had been flagged as unstable. We told them it wasn't safe, but management refused to delay construction. I was up there when it collapsed. Broke my hip, shattered my knee, spent months in the hospital, couldn't work again." A heavy silence filled the room. The jury members shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of his testimony. Jessica turned toward Brandon. "And did Mr. Cole ever reach out to you? Offer support? Compensation?" Leonard let out a bitter chuckle. "Not a damn thing. They fired me while I was in recovery, sent a letter saying I was being let go due to downsizing." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Brandon rolled his eyes and leaned back, whispering to Whitmore, "This is all emotional nonsense. No one cares about some guy who couldn't do his job." Unfortunately for him, his microphone was still on. His words echoed through the speakers, loud and clear. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Jurors turned to each other, their expressions shifting. Leonard Tate's face hardened, but he said nothing. Judge Bennett stared at Brandon, his face unreadable. Then in a low, commanding voice, he said, "Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Brandon hesitated for a split second. Then he smirked. "Yeah, I don't apologize for running a business." The moment the words left his mouth, Whitmore slammed his forehead into his palm. Jessica Owens turned to the jury, barely concealing her satisfaction. She didn't have to argue any further. Brandon had just made their case for them. Judge Bennett let the silence stretch, then calmly said, "Noted." He struck his gavel. "We'll resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court adjourned." Brandon rose from his seat, still unfazed. As he walked past Leonard Tate, he didn't even glance his way. But Leonard turned to Jessica, whispering, "He thinks he's untouchable." Jessica's eyes narrowed. Not for long. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Bennett remained seated for a moment, watching Brandon leave. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. Brandon had no idea what was coming for him. The following morning, the Fulton County Courthouse was abuzz with energy. Reporters crowded outside, eager to dissect the previous day's shocking events. Brandon Cole's arrogant refusal to stand, his careless remarks about Leonard Tate, and his complete disregard for the judicial system had made headline news overnight. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The jury had taken their seats, their expressions noticeably different from the day before. Some looked skeptical, others downright disapproving. Brandon's behavior had not done him any favors. As Judge Bennett entered, the entire courtroom stood in unison. This time, even Brandon hesitated before getting to his feet, rolling his eyes as he did so. Jessica Owens noticed. He's starting to realize this isn't just another business deal he can manipulate. Judge Bennett took his seat, adjusted his robe, and glanced down at his docket. Then, without looking up, he said, "Mr. Cole, I see you finally decided to acknowledge the authority of this court." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the spectators. Brandon clenched his jaw but said nothing. Bennett continued, "Miss Owens, you may call your next witness." Jessica rose smoothly. "The state calls Detective Marcus Hayes to the stand." A hush fell over the room as Detective Hayes, a seasoned investigator from the Financial Crimes Division, walked confidently toward the witness stand. His neatly pressed suit and sharp, no-nonsense demeanor commanded instant respect. After he was sworn in, Jessica approached, keeping her tone professional but firm. "Detective Hayes, you were the lead investigator in the financial fraud case against Mr. Cole. Can you describe what you uncovered during your investigation?" Hayes nodded. "My team reviewed internal financial records from Cole Industries. What we found was a pattern of deliberate deception, inflated revenue reports, fabricated safety certifications, and funds being siphoned into offshore accounts." The jury leaned forward. Brandon shifted slightly in his chair, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. Jessica paced slowly. "So to be clear, Mr. Cole was aware of these fraudulent activities?" Hayes gave a curt nod. "Yes. His signature is on multiple forged safety compliance reports. He personally approved cost-cutting measures that directly compromised worker safety. We also have email correspondences where he tells his CFO to bury the numbers so investors wouldn't see the real financial losses." Brandon leaned toward Whitmore, whispering urgently, "You told me they wouldn't have hard evidence." Whitmore's expression was grim. "I told you we should have settled." Jessica turned to the jury. "Detective, in your professional opinion, was this simply a clerical oversight, or was there intent to deceive?" "Intent without a doubt," Hayes replied. "Everything was designed to hide liability and maximize profit, regardless of who got hurt in the process." Jessica nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Bennett turned to Whitmore. "Defense, your witness." Whitmore stood, buttoning his jacket. He approached Hayes with a calm, collected demeanor, but everyone could sense the tension in his steps. "Detective Hayes," he began, "you've been involved in numerous corporate fraud investigations, correct?" "That's correct." "And is it common for large businesses to have discrepancies in their financial records?" Hayes tilted his head slightly. "Discrepancies, yes. Systemic fraud? Not unless someone is deliberately covering it up." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "These offshore accounts, are you saying every dollar was stolen from employees?" "No," Hayes admitted, "but millions in corporate revenue were rerouted into personal expenditures. Private jets, luxury estates, and untraceable shell companies." "Objection," Whitmore said, turning to the judge. "Speculation." "Overruled," Bennett replied without hesitation. "Detective Hayes, continue." Hayes looked straight at Brandon as he spoke. "Mr. Cole wasn't just taking shortcuts. He was stealing from his own workers and gambling on their lives." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Brandon clenched his fists. Whitmore quickly wrapped up his questioning, but the damage had been done. As Hayes stepped down from the stand, it was clear that the jury was no longer viewing Brandon as a misunderstood businessman. They were beginning to see him as a calculated criminal. During a recess, Brandon stormed into a private meeting room, slamming the door behind him. Whitmore followed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is bad, Brandon," Whitmore hissed. "The jury is turning against you." Brandon threw his hands in the air. "Then do something about it. That detective made me sound like some kind of mob boss." Whitmore sighed. Because you acted like one. Brandon's nostrils flared. I don't care how this looks. I'm not spending a single day in prison. I want this case dismissed. Whitmore hesitated. That's not possible, Brandon. Not with the evidence they have. Brandon's face darkened. Then make it possible. That's what I pay you for. Whitmore didn't respond right away. He was beginning to realize that Brandon was delusional and that his arrogance was pushing him straight toward a guilty verdict. Just then, there was a knock at the door. A court officer stepped inside. Mr. Cole, court is resuming in 5 minutes. Judge Bennett is waiting. Brandon scoffed, straightened his tie, and turned to Whitmore. Then let's go show that judge who's really in charge. Whitmore didn't move. For the first time, he considered walking away from this case entirely, because deep down, he knew Brandon was already a dead man walking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Brandon strutted back into the courtroom, his self-assured smirk firmly in place, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The jury members sat with arms crossed, some exchanging side glances. Even the spectators seemed to have turned colder. Jessica Owens sat at the prosecution's table, calm and composed, but there was a knowing glint in her eyes. She had seen this happen before. A man so sure of his invincibility that he never realized he was already sinking. Judge Bennett returned to his bench, his presence commanding instant silence. He adjusted his robe before speaking. Ms. Owens, you may call your next witness. Jessica stood. The state calls Maya Tate to the stand. A stir spread through the courtroom as a young woman in her early 20s walked cautiously toward the witness stand. Unlike her father, Leonard Tate, Maya radiated quiet strength, though her hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in. Brandon barely reacted. He didn't even recognize her. Jessica approached with a gentle but firm tone. Maya, can you please state your relation to Leonard Tate? Maya nodded. He's my father. And what impact did Mr. Cole's actions have on your family? Maya's eyes flickered toward Brandon for a brief second before she turned back to Jessica. They destroyed us. The room fell into a deep silence. Jessica let her continue at her own pace. My dad worked for Cole Industries for almost 15 years. He was proud of what he did. Then one day he got hurt. The scaffolding collapsed and suddenly he wasn't an employee anymore. He was a liability. Her voice grew stronger. They fired him while he was still in the hospital. No severance, no benefits, just a letter saying he was no longer needed. Jessica paced slowly before the jury. And what did that mean for your family? Maya swallowed hard. It meant we lost everything. My dad couldn't work, and my mom had to take 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. I had to drop out of college because we couldn't afford tuition anymore. Jessica turned back to her. Did Mr. Cole ever personally reach out to your father? Maya let out a bitter laugh. Personally. We weren't important enough for him to notice, but his company sent us a bill for the equipment they claimed my dad damaged when he fell. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the jurors looked horrified. Jessica let the moment settle before speaking again. If Mr. Cole were standing before you now, what would you say to him? Maya turned toward Brandon, her eyes locking onto his for the first time. I'd tell him he's a coward. A sharp silence fell over the room. Brandon stiffened, his smirk faltering for a second. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. Because a real man doesn't abandon the people who work to build his success. A real man takes responsibility. Jessica gave her a small nod. No further questions, Your Honor? Whitmore rose from his seat, his usual calm shaken. He knew there was no way to spin this testimony. Instead, he opted for a different approach. Maya, he began smoothly, I'm truly sorry for what happened to your father. But do you have any proof that Mr. Cole was personally involved in his termination? Maya's jaw tightened. I have the letter. His company signed it. But not him, Whitmore countered. You see, Cole Industries is a massive corporation. Decisions like these are often made by mid-level executives, not the CEO himself. Isn't it possible that Mr. Cole was simply unaware? Maya hesitated, and that was all Brandon needed to pounce. Oh, give me a break, Brandon muttered loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jessica Owens's head snapped up. Whitmore turned toward his client in horror. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. Mr. Cole, Do you have something to say? Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk returning. This is all so dramatic, he said, waving a hand dismissively. I mean, come on. People lose jobs all the time. Do they all get a sympathy parade in court? A collective gasp filled the room. Maya's face hardened. Jessica didn't even need to say anything, because Brandon had just buried himself. Judge Bennett slowly removed his glasses, placing them on his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of steel beneath it. Mr. Cole, I will remind you that this is a court of law. If you speak out of turn again, I will hold you in contempt. Brandon rolled his eyes. Noted. Jessica folded her arms, watching as Judge Bennett's expression darkened. Mr. Whitmore, control your client, Bennett said, his voice dangerously calm. Whitmore looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Bennett turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we will adjourn for today. Court will resume at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Gavel strike. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as people stood, exchanging glances. Brandon stood too, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, completely unfazed. He had no idea that Judge Bennett had already made up his mind about him. The next morning, the atmosphere in Fulton County Courthouse was noticeably different. The jury members arrived with serious expressions, some clutching their notes more tightly than the day before. The public gallery was packed, the anticipation buzzing through the air, and at the center of it all sat Brandon Cole, still utterly unbothered. Dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, he lounged in his chair at the defense table, scrolling through his phone as if he were waiting for a delayed dinner reservation rather than a trial that could send him to prison. His attorney, Gerald Whitmore, had given up trying to control him. After yesterday's disaster, Brandon openly mocking Maya Tate and dismissing her suffering in front of the jury, the case was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. Jessica Owens, however, was sharper than ever. She had momentum, and she intended to use it. The moment Judge Bennett entered the courtroom, everyone stood except Brandon, who took a few extra seconds before lazily rising to his feet. The judge took note of it but said nothing. Ms. Owens, Judge Bennett said as he settled into his seat, you may proceed. Jessica stood, her confidence unwavering. The prosecution calls Elliot Grayson, former chief financial officer of Cole Industries, to the stand. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. This was unexpected. Brandon's expression finally shifted. He sat up straighter, his smirk slipping slightly as his former CFO walked toward the stand. Elliot Grayson was a key figure in Brandon's empire. He had worked for Cole Industries for nearly a decade, overseeing the company's financial decisions. If anyone knew the truth about Brandon's shady dealings, it was him. After Grayson was sworn in, Jessica approached with a composed but deliberate air. Mr. Grayson, can you describe your role at Cole Industries? The older man adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. I was the chief financial officer. I oversaw the company's financial records, investor reports, and compliance with federal regulations. Jessica nodded. And during your tenure, did you ever have concerns about Mr. Cole's business practices? Brandon's teeth clenched. Elliot hesitated, then exhaled. Yes. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Jessica let the jury absorb the weight of that single word before continuing. Could you elaborate? Elliot glanced toward Brandon, who was now glaring daggers at him. Then he turned back to Jessica. There were irregularities, he admitted. Numbers that didn't add up. Safety compliance reports that were altered before submission. And money, millions, moved through offshore accounts to avoid detection. Jessica took a step closer. Did Mr. Cole personally authorize these actions? Elliot swallowed hard. Then with deliberate slowness, he nodded. Yes. Every major decision passed through his hands. He knew exactly what he was doing. Brandon slammed his hand on the table, his voice boiling over. This is bullshit! A wave of gasps filled the room. Whitmore whipped his head toward his client, his face ashen. Judge Bennett's gaze darkened. He didn't even raise his voice as he spoke. Mr. Cole, stand up. Brandon froze, his jaw tightening. I said, stand up. The courtroom went silent. Brandon rose slowly, but he did so with a smug smirk, rolling his shoulders as if none of this mattered. Judge Bennett locked eyes with him. "This is your final warning. You are in a court of law. If you interrupt again, I will hold you in contempt of court, and you will be removed from these proceedings." Brandon's lip curled, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded and sat back down, his fists clenched. Jessica turned back to Elliot Grayson. "One final question, Mr. Grayson. Why are you coming forward now?" Elliot let out a long breath. "Because I should have done it years ago." Jessica's expression softened, and she turned toward the jury. "No further questions, Your Honor." The damage was done. During recess, Brandon stormed into a private conference room, slamming the door behind him. Whitmore entered a second later, his expression borderline furious. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. Brandon paced, his hands raking through his hair. "He was supposed to keep his mouth shut. I paid him to stay quiet." Whitmore stared at him. "You paid him to stay quiet?" Brandon stopped, realizing his mistake. His face flushed red. Whitmore exhaled. "Brandon, listen to me. We need to do damage control. That outburst just proved the prosecution's point. You're making this personal, and you're giving the jury every reason to hate you." Brandon gritted his teeth. "So what do you suggest, Gerald? That I sit there and let them drag my name through the mud?" Whitmore's voice dropped lower. "I suggest you start acting like a man who wants to win this case." Brandon's nostrils flared. "I don't need to win. I just need to make sure that judge doesn't screw me over." Whitmore shook his head. "Bennett's not your problem anymore." Brandon narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Whitmore hesitated, then sighed. "I mean that the jury is already against you, and if you keep acting like this, they'll bury you alive." Brandon didn't answer. He simply stared at the door, his mind working furiously. Finally, a slow smirk crept onto his lips. "We'll see about that," he muttered. And with that, he pushed past Whitmore and walked back toward the courtroom, where his fate was already being sealed. The next session of Brandon Cole's trial began under a storm of media speculation. The events of the previous day, his courtroom outburst, Elliot Grayson's testimony, and Judge Bennett's final warning, had made headlines overnight. Inside the Fulton County Courthouse, a tense air settled over the courtroom. The jury members took their seats, their expressions now filled with subtle but unmistakable skepticism toward Brandon. He was no longer just an arrogant businessman. He was a man unraveling in real time. At the defense table, Gerald Whitmore sat with his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming lightly against a legal pad. He could feel the shift in momentum, and it wasn't in their favor. Meanwhile, Brandon sat beside him, unapologetically relaxed, arms draped over the chair like he was at a country club instead of a trial that could send him to prison. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Bennett entered, his usual composed expression unchanged. As everyone rose in unison, Brandon hesitated for just a second before begrudgingly standing. Judge Bennett took his seat, glanced at the case file, then looked directly at Brandon. "Mr. Cole, I trust there will be no further disruptions today?" Brandon smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. "That depends on how ridiculous this gets." Whitmore visibly winced. Jessica Owens didn't react, but she could sense that Judge Bennett had finally had enough. The judge let the silence drag for a few beats before speaking. "Miss Owens, proceed." Jessica stood, walking toward the jury with measured steps. "The state calls Dr. Benjamin Carter to the stand." A middle-aged man in a dark suit rose from the public gallery. He walked to the witness stand, adjusting his glasses as he was sworn in. Brandon leaned toward Whitmore, whispering, "Who the hell is this guy?" Whitmore exhaled sharply. "The medical expert from OSHA, the one who reviewed the injuries at your construction sites." Brandon rolled his eyes. "Great. More sob stories." Whitmore ignored him. Once Dr. Carter was seated, Jessica began. "Dr. Carter, can you state your professional credentials for the court?" Dr. Carter nodded. "I am a senior investigator with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. I have over 25 years of experience in workplace safety investigations, specifically in construction-related injuries and fatalities." Jessica nodded. "And during your investigation, did you find any evidence of negligence on Mr. Cole's construction sites?" Dr. Carter's eyes flicked toward Brandon for a moment before answering. Yes, extensive evidence. The jury leaned forward slightly. Can you elaborate? Jessica prompted. Dr. Carter opened a thick binder and pulled out a series of reports. We found that multiple work sites under coal industries management lacked essential safety measures. Workers were made to operate without proper protective gear. Scaffolding was improperly installed, and in several cases, inspections were forged to show compliance with federal regulations. Jessica gestured toward the binder. Are these official OSHA reports? Yes, each report documents violations that directly led to injuries. In fact, we found that had proper measures been taken, at least 4 major accidents, including the one that injured Mr. Leonard Tate, could have been prevented entirely. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jessica turned to the jury. Dr. Carter, in your professional opinion, did coal industries intentionally disregard safety regulations? Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. Jessica let that statement settle before saying, no further questions, Your Honor. Whitmore rose, visibly tense. He knew there was no salvaging this, but he had to try. Dr. Carter, he began, you investigate a lot of businesses, correct? Yes. And it's not uncommon for construction sites to have some safety violations, correct? Correct, but Whitmore raised a hand. Just a yes or no, please. Would you say that most companies you investigate have at least some level of safety infractions? Dr. Carter hesitated, then sighed. Yes. Whitmore nodded. And would you say Coal Industries is no different than any other construction firm in that regard? Brandon smirked, relaxing back into his chair. Dr. Carter, however, shut that down immediately. No, Mr. Whitmore, Coal Industries is different because they knowingly falsified safety reports, they ignored repeated warnings, and Mr. Cole himself approved measures that put workers directly in danger. Brandon's smirk disappeared. Whitmore exhaled sharply. There was nothing more to argue. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Bennett gave Whitmore a long, measured look, then turned toward Brandon. Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say for yourself? Brandon shrugged, shaking his head. I don't run a charity, Your Honor. If people can't handle the job, they shouldn't take it. Jessica couldn't believe her luck. She turned to the jury, letting Brandon's words sink in. Judge Bennett took a long pause, then finally spoke. We will reconvene after lunch. Court dismissed. Gavel strike. As the courtroom emptied, Whitmore turned to Brandon, his face filled with pure frustration. You just made every single juror hate you. Brandon laughed. They hated me already. Whitmore closed his briefcase slowly, his movements deliberate. You still don't get it, do you? Brandon smirked. Oh, I get it. But I don't lose, Gerald. Whitmore stared at him for a moment longer. Then he shook his head. Maybe not in business, but in here, you're already buried. And with that, Whitmore walked away, leaving Brandon sitting alone at the defense table. For the first time since the trial began, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. But it was too late. The tide had already turned. As the lunch recess ended, the jury members filed back into the courtroom. Some carried coffee, others exchanged quiet glances. But the overall mood was noticeably more resolute. The weight of Dr. Carter's testimony still hung heavy in the air. Brandon Cole, however, was unmoved. He sat at the defense table, rolling a gold pen between his fingers, looking more bored than concerned. If anything, he seemed amused by how the case was unfolding. Gerald Whitmore returned, setting his briefcase down with a controlled exhale. He glanced at his client and for the first time felt nothing but frustration. Brandon, Whitmore said under his breath, we have to talk about damage control. You are losing this jury. Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. The jury was never on my side, Gerald. This whole trial is a joke. Whitmore clenched his jaw. A joke that could land you in prison? Brandon leaned in, lowering his voice. And what do you think will happen after that, huh? You think I won't appeal? You think I'll spend a single night in a real cell? Whitmore stared at him, his expression unreadable. Brandon smirked. Relax, Gerald. You worry too much. Before Whitmore could respond, Judge Bennett entered the courtroom. Once again, the entire room stood, This time, Brandon followed immediately, though the slight smirk never left his face. Judge Bennett settled into his seat and looked toward Jessica Owens. "Miss Owens, you may call your next witness." Jessica nodded and stood. "The state calls Sylvia Reynolds to the stand." A few whispers spread through the courtroom as a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her auburn hair walked toward the stand. Brandon's smirk faded slightly. He didn't recognize her, but the jury did, because Sylvia Reynolds was juror number 7. Whitmore visibly tensed as Sylvia was sworn in. This was unexpected. Jessica Owens approached, perfectly composed. "Ms. Reynolds, can you tell the court your former occupation?" Sylvia straightened her posture. "I was a senior compliance officer for the State Department of Labor for over 30 years. My job was to audit workplace violations, ensuring companies followed federal safety laws." Jessica turned toward the jury. "So you are well-versed in corporate accountability, correct?" "Yes." "And before this trial, were you familiar with coal industries?" Sylvia nodded. "Very familiar. I was assigned to investigate multiple complaints against them over the years. Unfortunately, every time we got close to taking action, Mr. Cole's legal team buried us in appeals and technical loopholes." Brandon stiffened slightly. Jessica's expression remained neutral. "And what did you find in your audits?" Sylvia took a deep breath. "That coal industries repeatedly and deliberately cut safety measures to maximize profit. They underreported workplace injuries, falsified compliance records, and pressured employees into staying silent about hazardous conditions." She turned toward Brandon. "I personally tried to hold you accountable 5 years ago, Mr. Cole, but you shut us down before we could even issue fines." Brandon said nothing, but his fingers curled tightly around his gold pen. Jessica let the moment stretch, allowing the jury to absorb the significance of what they were hearing. "Miss Reynolds," she finally said, "in your professional experience, how many CEOs personally approve safety violations?" Sylvia didn't hesitate. "Only the ones who think they're untouchable." Brandon exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Jessica turned toward the jury. "No further questions, Your Honor." Whitmore knew he had to act fast. He stood, smoothing out his suit jacket before stepping toward the witness stand. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, his voice calm, "while I appreciate your history in compliance audits, would you agree that most companies occasionally have minor violations?" Sylvia tilted her head. "Minor violations, yes. But what Mr. Cole did wasn't minor. It was a pattern of deception." Whitmore nodded. "And yet, despite all these alleged violations, Cole Industries has remained a major player in the construction industry. If these issues were truly as severe as you claim, wouldn't regulators have shut them down years ago?" Sylvia's lips pressed together. "Because men like Mr. Cole know how to work the system." Brandon scoffed loudly. Jessica glanced at him sharply, sensing another mistake coming. Whitmore, ignoring Brandon, continued. "And yet, Ms. Reynolds, isn't it true that you never directly investigated Brandon Cole himself? Only his company?" Sylvia narrowed her eyes. "Because he surrounded himself with enough legal buffers to keep his hands clean." Whitmore nodded, as if that was exactly the point he wanted to make. "But you have no physical evidence that Mr. Cole himself ordered these violations, correct?" Sylvia hesitated, just for a second, and Brandon pounced. "Oh, come on," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This woman's been trying to come after me for years. She's probably thrilled to be on the stand right now." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Whitmore closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Jessica slowly turned back toward the jury, her expression unreadable. But she didn't need to say anything, because Brandon had just destroyed himself. Judge Bennett removed his glasses and folded his hands before him. "Mr. Cole." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Brandon smirked, as if he still thought this was a game. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Bennett's gaze hardened. "Stand up." Brandon hesitated, but under the crushing weight of silence, he finally stood. Judge Bennett's voice remained even. "I will remind you for the last time that this is a court of law. If you speak out of turn again, I will hold you in contempt and have you removed from these proceedings. Do I make myself clear?" Brandon clenched his jaw. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his posture. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Bennett nodded once. Then sit down and keep your mouth shut. Brandon lowered himself back into his seat, gripping the edge of the table tightly. Whitmore was done. He looked at his client, shaking his head slightly. You just lost the case, Brandon. And this time, Brandon knew he was right. The courtroom was silent as Brandon Cole sat at the defense table, his smirk long gone. The weight of the trial was finally starting to press down on him, and for the first time since it began, he felt something close to fear. Jessica Owens had orchestrated a devastating case, methodically exposing Brandon's corruption piece by piece. Elliot Grayson's betrayal, Dr. Carter's safety violation reports, and Sylvia Reynolds' testimony had chipped away at his defense, turning the jury firmly against him. And now it was time for the final blow. As the judge called the court back into session, Jessica stood with deliberate control. She glanced at the jury, then turned toward the bench. Your Honor, she said, her voice even, the prosecution would like to submit newly recovered digital evidence into the record. Brandon froze. Whitmore tensed beside him. What evidence? He muttered under his breath. Jessica continued. We have obtained a series of private emails and text messages between Mr. Cole and his executive team, directly instructing them to doctor safety reports, suppress whistleblowers, and divert company funds into offshore accounts. The jury's attention sharpened. Judge Bennett turned toward Jessica. Are these communications verified? Jessica nodded. Yes, Your Honor. They were recovered from Mr. Elliot Grayson's personal hard drive and authenticated by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Forensics Unit. Brandon's stomach dropped. Whitmore was already flipping through his notes, his face pale. Judge, the defense requests time to review. Judge Bennett raised a hand. Denied. Miss Owens, please present your evidence. Jessica nodded toward the court technician, who projected the emails onto the large screen. Brandon stared in horror as his own words glowed on display for the entire courtroom to see. Email from Brandon Cole to CFO Elliot Grayson, dated 2 years ago. Keep OSHA out of this. I don't care what the report says. Bury the numbers and make sure nobody talks. If someone gives us problems, fire them. Email from Brandon Cole to VP of Operations. If we delay the project for safety inspections, we lose investors. Just sign the damn forms and move on. Text message from Brandon Cole to an unnamed executive. The accident report is going to be a problem. Shut it down before it hits the board. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Brandon felt like he was suffocating. Whitmore placed a hand over his forehead, his career flashing before his eyes. Jessica let the silence hang, giving the jury time to absorb the gravity of what they had just seen. Then she turned to the witness stand. Mr. Grayson, are these the emails you provided to law enforcement? Elliot Grayson, sitting stiffly in the witness chair, nodded once. Yes, every single one. Jessica pivoted to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the evidence. These aren't just corporate oversights. These aren't accidental violations. These are calculated crimes committed by a man who believed he was above the law. Brandon clenched his fists under the table. The room felt smaller, hotter. He was losing control. Judge Bennett turned to the defense table. Mr. Whitmore, does the defense have a response? Whitmore slowly stood, adjusting his tie. He had defended hundreds of powerful clients before, but this was impossible. The defense would like to request a recess to confer with our client. Judge Bennett's gaze was ice cold. Motion denied. You may proceed with your cross-examination now. Whitmore had no choice. He turned toward Grayson, forcing himself to keep his voice even. Mr. Grayson, these emails, you said they were recovered from your hard drive? Grayson nodded. Correct. Whitmore exhaled. And yet, you worked under Mr. Cole for nearly 10 years before you decided to come forward. Why now? Grayson hesitated. Whitmore seized the moment. Mr. Grayson, isn't it true that you personally benefited from many of these financial transactions? Grayson shifted in his seat. I was following orders. But you were also being paid handsomely to follow them, weren't you? Grayson hesitated again, and for a brief second, Brandon's hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, Whitmore could. Jessica cut in smoothly. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution has already established that Mr. Grayson's testimony is corroborated by forensic evidence. Whether or not he personally benefited doesn't change the fact that these are Mr. Cole's own words. Judge Bennett nodded. Sustained. Mr. Whitmore, move on. Brandon's flicker of hope snuffed out instantly. Whitmore closed his file. No further questions. Judge Bennett turned toward Jessica. Ms. Owens, does the prosecution have anything else to submit? Jessica nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She walked toward the jury box, her voice measured and strong. We have presented witness testimony, forensic evidence, and now Mr. Cole's own words, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he knowingly broke the law. He exploited workers, falsified safety records, and manipulated financial systems for personal gain. And when he was caught, he did everything in his power to cover it up. She turned directly toward Brandon, her eyes locked on his. But today, Mr. Cole, the cover-up ends. Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. Judge Bennett sat back, his expression unreadable. Very well, we will adjourn for the day. Closing arguments will begin tomorrow morning. Gavel strike. As the courtroom emptied, Brandon remained seated, his body stiff. Whitmore gathered his papers, his silence louder than any words. For the first time, Brandon understood what was happening. This wasn't just bad PR. This wasn't something he could buy his way out of. This was real. And tomorrow his fate would be sealed. The moment the court adjourned, Brandon bolted from his seat, pushing past the reporters and legal aides who swarmed the hallways of the Fulton County Courthouse. His pulse pounded in his ears, his thoughts spiraling as he tried to grasp at some last shred of control. Whitmore struggled to keep up with him. Brandon, we need to talk about... But Brandon wasn't listening. He had his own plan. He spotted a group of reporters outside the courthouse doors, their cameras trained on him. For the first time in the trial, he saw an opportunity. His public image had always been his greatest weapon. He had charmed investors, manipulated the press, and spun countless scandals in his favor before. He could do it again. As he reached the courthouse steps, a dozen microphones were shoved in his face. Mr. Cole, do you have a statement? How do you respond to the evidence? Do you regret your past decisions? Brandon took a breath, then flashed his signature smirk. He had played the villain long enough. Now he just needed to switch the script. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone carefully measured. I think we all know this trial isn't about justice. This is about political ambition. A prosecutor who wants to make a name for herself, and a judge who wants to see a powerful man fall. Whitmore froze. Brandon, don't... Brandon ignored him, turning to the cameras like a seasoned politician. This entire case is built on fabricated evidence and biased witnesses. People who have personal vendettas against me, trying to bring me down. This is a witch hunt, plain and simple. The reporters scribbled furiously, but some exchanged skeptical glances. Even in the cutthroat world of business, fraud was still fraud. Brandon pressed on. I have built businesses, created thousands of jobs, and given more to this city than most politicians ever have, and yet they want to destroy me over some paperwork errors? Whitmore rubbed his temples, already anticipating the fallout. Mr. Cole, one reporter shouted, what about the emails proving you authorized safety violations? Brandon laughed, shaking his head. You really believe that nonsense? If you dig deep enough, you'll find anyone can be made to look guilty. Are you saying the emails were forged? Brandon's smirk widened. I'm saying I'm the target of a system that hates successful people. Whitmore turned away, muttering under his breath. Jesus Christ, Brandon. Before Brandon could say anything more, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Cole. Brandon turned to see Jessica Owens standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, arms crossed, a knowing smile playing on her lips. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. You are a target, but not because you're successful. She took a step closer. You're a target because you broke the law. And tomorrow, the jury is going to prove that. Brandon felt his confidence crack, just for a second. Then he scoffed, masking the flicker of fear with arrogance. We'll see about that. Jessica simply nodded. Yes, we will. With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Brandon standing alone in front of the cameras. And for the first time, the press didn't look convinced. That night, Brandon Cole sat alone in his penthouse. His lawyers had left, his PR team had stopped calling, and for the first time in his entire career, there was no one to spin the story for him. He poured himself a drink, staring at the skyline of Atlanta, the city he had once ruled like a king. Tomorrow, it could all be gone. He took a sip of whiskey, the burn doing nothing to settle his nerves. The emails had been bad, but the jury's faces, the way they had looked at him after reading his words, that was worse. He had always known how to control people. But the jury, he had lost them. A faint sound made him look toward his front door. He frowned. A knock? At this hour? Setting down his glass, he walked over, pulling it open. Standing there under the dim hallway lights was Gerald Whitmore. His suit was slightly rumpled, and his expression was unreadable. Brandon leaned against the doorframe. "Gerald, what, here to tell me how screwed I am?" Whitmore stared at him for a long moment. Then in a voice quiet but firm, he said, "Brandon, it's time to take a deal." Brandon froze. Whitmore continued, "The prosecution is ready to offer reduced sentencing if you cooperate. But this is your last chance. Because if that jury finds you guilty, you're looking at years, not months." Brandon laughed, shaking his head. "You think I'm taking a deal? I'm not some nobody, Gerald. I don't take deals." Whitmore sighed. "Then you're going to lose." Brandon's smirk faltered. "The jury hasn't ruled yet." "They don't have to," Whitmore said. "I saw their faces. It's over." Brandon swallowed hard, the words hitting him harder than he wanted to admit. "Go home, Gerald," he muttered, stepping back into his penthouse. Whitmore studied him for a long moment before nodding. But as the door clicked shut, Brandon felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. Real, palpable fear. Tomorrow the jury would decide his fate, and for the first time he knew he might not walk away from this. The morning of the verdict arrived with an unusual stillness. The media frenzy outside Fulton County Courthouse was at its peak. Journalists, camera crews, and spectators had gathered in droves, waiting for the final decision in what had become one of the most talked about trials in Atlanta's history. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The jury had spent the entire night deliberating, and now everyone was eager to hear whether Brandon Cole would walk free or face the consequences of his crimes. Brandon sat at the defense table, his confidence noticeably shaken. He had barely slept. His mind had run in endless circles, replaying every mistake, every outburst, every damning piece of evidence Jessica Owens had thrown at him. He told himself it didn't matter, that money would fix this, that his lawyers would figure something out, that this jury, these regular working-class people, didn't have the power to bring him down. And yet, as the bailiff called for order and the jury filed in, something deep inside him twisted. They wouldn't look at him. That wasn't a good sign. Whitmore sat beside him, unusually quiet. He had done everything he could, but he knew what was coming. Judge Bennett entered and took his seat. The room fell into complete silence. "The jury has reached a verdict," the court clerk announced. Brandon exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. The jury foreman, a middle-aged black man in a charcoal suit, stood with a paper in hand. His voice was steady but final. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant, Brandon Cole, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Brandon's jaw tightened. His fingers dug into his chair. The foreman continued. "On the charge of falsifying financial records, guilty." More murmurs. Brandon's stomach dropped. "On the charge of willful negligence leading to injury, guilty." Brandon felt the walls closing in. His throat was dry. His suit suddenly felt too tight. He turned to Whitmore, expecting him to object, to do something, to save him. But Whitmore just sat there, stone-faced. The jury had spoken. Judge Bennett nodded slowly. He turned to the jury. "Thank you for your service. You are dismissed." The jury filed out, some exchanging glances, others looking relieved. Judge Bennett looked toward Brandon, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Cole, please rise." Brandon didn't move. A beat passed, then another. Whitmore nudged him under the table. "Brandon, get up." Slowly, mechanically, Brandon stood, his entire body rigid. Judge Bennett folded his hands together. Mr. Cole, you have been found guilty on all counts. This court will now move into the sentencing phase. We will reconvene after a brief recess. Gavel strike. The sound rang in Brandon's ears like a death sentence. As the courtroom erupted into whispers and movement, Brandon just stood there, frozen. His world was crashing down, and for the first time in his life, he had no way to stop it. As the recess began, Brandon was led into a private holding area within the courthouse, a stark, windowless room with nothing but a steel table and 2 chairs. He had never felt so trapped in his life. He ran his hands over his face, trying to steady his breath. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. He was Brandon Cole. He didn't lose. A few minutes later, the door swung open. Whitmore entered first, followed by Jessica Owens, who held a folder in her hands. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, her expression completely neutral. Brandon scoffed, trying to summon the arrogance that had always been his shield. "You must be loving this, huh?" Jessica didn't react. She simply opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Brandon glanced at it but didn't pick it up. Then he noticed the header. Plea agreement, sentencing reduction consideration. He laughed dryly. "You want me to beg for mercy now?" "Not happening." Jessica leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Cole, let me be clear. The jury found you guilty on all counts. That means when Judge Bennett sentences you, you're facing a minimum of 10 years in federal prison, possibly more, depending on the circumstances." Brandon's smirk faltered. Jessica tapped the folder. "The prosecution is offering a 5-year sentence instead of 10, with a possibility of parole after 3, if you sign this plea deal and admit guilt." Brandon's hands curled into fists. He knew the smart thing to do, but his pride wouldn't let him. "You think I'm going to sit in a cell for 5 years?" he growled. Jessica exhaled, not surprised by his reaction. "No, Mr. Cole," she said calmly. "I think you're going to sit in a cell for 10. She slid the document closer. "This is the last offer. Once sentencing starts, it's out of my hands." Brandon's pulse pounded. He looked down at the paper, at the empty line where his signature should go. He could feel Whitmore staring at him, waiting for him to make the right decision. His lawyer, the man who had fought to keep him out of this mess, finally spoke. "Brandon," Whitmore said quietly, "take the deal." Brandon gritted his teeth. Then slowly he pushed the document away. Jessica nodded, completely unfazed. "Okay," she said simply, standing up and closing the folder. Brandon expected her to try again, to bargain, to pressure him, but instead she just walked away. Because she knew something that he refused to accept. She didn't need his plea deal. She already won. As the door clicked shut, Brandon finally let his mask slip. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, and no amount of money was going to change that. After the recess ended, the courtroom was packed once again, but this time, there was a different energy in the air. The jury had spoken, and now the only thing standing between Brandon Cole and a decade behind bars was Judge Marcus Bennett's final ruling. Brandon returned to his seat at the defense table, his face a mask of forced indifference. But deep down, he could feel it. His world was closing in. Whitmore leaned over, voice low. "This is it. If you have anything to say to mitigate the damage, now is the time." Brandon clenched his jaw. "I'm not begging for mercy." Whitmore sighed. "Then you'll take whatever he gives you." Brandon turned away, ignoring him. A gavel strike rang through the room, pulling all attention back to the bench. Judge Bennett looked calm, but there was a distinct weight in his expression. He shuffled through his notes, pausing for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Cole, you have been found guilty on all counts." His voice was even, but the finality in his tone sent a chill through the room. Brandon exhaled slowly, staring straight ahead. Judge Bennett continued. "This court has heard overwhelming evidence that you knowingly and willfully engaged in corporate fraud, endangerment, and obstruction of justice. You operated under the belief that your wealth and influence placed you above the law." Brandon's fingers dug into the table. Judge Bennett's voice remained steady. "You ignored repeated warnings about safety violations, putting lives at risk in the name of profit. You falsified financial records, defrauding investors and employees alike. And when confronted with the consequences, you mock this court, the victims, and the legal system itself. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Bennett finally looked directly at Brandon, his eyes sharp. Mr. Cole, I have given you multiple opportunities to show even the slightest remorse. Instead, you have chosen to display nothing but arrogance. You have ridiculed witnesses, dismissed victims, and openly disrespected these proceedings. Brandon swallowed hard, but his face remained stoic. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. And because of that, I am left with no choice but to impose the maximum penalty allowed by law. A gasp rippled through the room. Brandon stiffened, his grip on the table tightening. Judge Bennett's voice was firm. I hereby sentence you to 10 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early parole for the first 5 years. Brandon's stomach dropped. No parole for 5 years. The reality hit him like a freight train. A loud murmur spread through the crowd, some gasping, others nodding in approval. But Judge Bennett wasn't done. In addition, you will be required to pay full financial restitution to the victims affected by your crimes, an amount totaling $25 million. Failure to comply will result in additional charges. Brandon's breathing quickened. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Judge Bennett straightened. You will be remanded to the custody of federal authorities immediately. Gavel strike. It is so ordered. For the first time in his entire life, Brandon Cole couldn't move. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but he couldn't hear them. His ears were ringing. He felt Whitmore stand next to him, but he couldn't look at him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was Brandon Cole. He didn't lose. He always walked away clean. Then he felt it, a firm grip on his arm. A bailiff had stepped forward. Sir, the bailiff said, voice low but firm. Time to go. Brandon finally looked up, and his gaze locked onto Jessica Owens. She was watching him, her face unreadable. And in that moment he knew. She had beaten him. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. He had spent his entire life in control, but now he was just another convicted felon being led away in handcuffs. As the bailiff escorted him toward the back exit, Brandon could hear the cameras clicking, capturing the exact moment he fell from grace. For the first time in his life, Brandon Cole was powerless, and there was nothing he could do about it. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and a tense, electric anticipation filled the air. The press, the public, and even those who had only heard whispers of the trial had gathered, all waiting for one thing, the sentencing of Brandon Cole. At the defense table, Brandon sat with his back straight, jaw clenched, and his hands gripping the edges of the table. He was wearing another perfectly tailored suit, but today, for the first time, it didn't feel like armor. It felt like a costume, an empty display of power in a room where he no longer had any. To his left, Gerald Whitmore looked exhausted. He hadn't spoken much to Brandon that morning, his frustration long since settled into quiet resignation. There was nothing left to do. Brandon had refused the plea deal, and now it was all up to Judge Marcus Bennett. The moment the side door opened and Judge Bennett entered, the room fell into complete silence. All rise. Everyone stood, and this time Brandon did too, immediately, without hesitation. It was a small thing, but the courtroom noticed. Judge Bennett settled into his seat, adjusting his robe before turning his sharp, unwavering gaze toward the defendant. Mr. Cole, please step forward for sentencing. Brandon swallowed hard, then rose to his feet, walking toward the podium with carefully measured steps. He had spent his entire life walking into rooms as the most powerful man there. Not today. Today he was at the mercy of a man he had disrespected, ignored, and underestimated. Judge Bennett studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. Mr. Cole, this court has heard overwhelming evidence of your fraudulent business practices, your reckless endangerment of employees, and your repeated attempts to manipulate the justice system. You have shown no remorse, taken no responsibility, and made it clear that you believe yourself to be above the law. Brandon's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. Judge Bennett continued. This court strongly disagrees with your assessment of yourself, and as such, I find it necessary to impose a sentence that will not only serve as punishment, but also as a lesson in accountability. Brandon's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The gallery leaned forward in anticipation. Judge Bennett took a breath, then delivered the sentence. Brandon Cole, you are hereby sentenced to 12 months in a federal prison facility with no possibility of early release. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Brandon's body locked up. He expected a fine. He expected probation. Not this. Judge Bennett wasn't finished. In addition, he continued, his voice firm and unwavering, you will complete 1,000 hours of community service, directly under the supervision of the victims affected by your crimes. Stunned silence. Then, whispers erupted. Brandon blinked, shaking his head slightly, as if he hadn't heard right. Prison? Community service? Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing. You have spent your life treating others as disposable, Mr. Cole. Now you will be placed in a position where you will have no choice but to see the consequences of your actions firsthand. Brandon turned sharply toward Whitmore, panic flickering in his gaze. Do something! Fix this! But Whitmore didn't move. He just sat there, still, silent, accepting. Brandon snapped back toward the judge. His voice, hoarse with disbelief, finally broke through the silence. You can't do this. Judge Bennett's expression didn't change. I can, and I have. Another gavel strike. Court is adjourned. The room exploded into chaos. Brandon barely heard any of it. He stood frozen, staring blankly ahead as reality crashed down around him. And then, before he could process what was happening, two officers approached, ready to take him into custody. For the first time in his life, Brandon Cole was no longer in control. Brandon's ears rang with the noise of the courtroom. Voices blurred together, some in shock, others in satisfaction, and a few in outright glee. But through all of it, one thing remained clear. He was going to prison, not probation, not a fine he could easily pay, not a settlement that would let him walk away. Real, actual prison. The officers flanked him, ready to escort him out. Brandon instinctively stepped back, his mind scrambling for a way out, for an option he hadn't considered. He turned to Whitmore, his last lifeline. Appeal it, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Tell them the sentence is excessive, unfair, illegal. Whitmore exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Brandon, that was legal, and it was fair. Brandon stared at him, a sudden wave of betrayal crashing into his chest. You're giving up? Whitmore's face was unreadable. No, Brandon, you did that all by yourself. Before Brandon could argue, the officer stepped in, taking him by the arms. Mr. Cole, you're coming with us. Brandon ripped his arms free, shoving one of them back. Don't touch me! The courtroom gasped. The officers immediately moved in again, firmer this time. Brandon, Whitmore said, his voice low and tired. Don't make this worse. But Brandon's entire body was on fire, with anger, with humiliation, with fear. I am Brandon Cole, he roared. You can't do this to me. Judge Bennett hadn't left the room yet. He turned back, watching silently, waiting to see if Brandon would make his final mistake. Brandon locked eyes with him. The judge's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze said it all. This isn't my doing, Mr. Cole. This is yours. And in that moment, the last shred of fight inside Brandon broke. His shoulders slumped. His hands stopped resisting. The officers cuffed him without another word. And just like that, Brandon Cole was no longer untouchable. Outside, the media swarmed like vultures. Cameras flashed as Brandon was led out of the courthouse, his hands cuffed in front of him. Reporters shouted over each other. Mr. Cole, do you have any comments? Brandon, do you feel the sentence was unfair? Do you regret anything? Brandon kept his head down, jaw clenched, grinding his teeth so hard they ached. From the corner of his eye, he saw Jessica Owens step out of the courthouse, surrounded by members of her legal team. A reporter turned to her immediately. Ms. Owens, what do you think of today's verdict? Jessica paused, glanced toward Brandon as he was being loaded into the transport van, and then answered, loud enough for him to hear. Justice was served. And with that, she walked away, leaving Brandon to face the consequences of his own choices. The next hours were a blur of humiliations. Stripped of his designer suit, his Rolex taken, fingerprints, mugshots, the sharp snap of latex gloves as he was searched. Everything that made him Brandon Cole, the billionaire businessman, was stripped away, piece by piece, until all that remained was inmate number 67293. His first night in county lockup was spent on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, the sound of shouting inmates and clanging bars filling the air around him. He wasn't special here. No one cared about his money. No one cared about his connections. No one cared about the fact that he used to sit at the top of the world. Here, he was just another convict, and that realization burned worse than anything else. After a week in lockup, Brandon was transferred to begin his court-ordered community service. The humiliation continued. He expected to be sent to some quiet, behind-the-scenes assignment, something easy, something where he wouldn't have to face anyone. Instead, he was assigned to work under the direct supervision of the very people he had harmed. His first shift? Cleaning the streets outside one of his own former buildings. Dressed in an orange vest, gripping a broom and shovel, Brandon Cole stood under the blazing Georgia sun, sweat dripping down his face, while a group of passers-by stopped to take pictures and laugh. He wanted to disappear. And then, he heard a voice. Didn't think I'd see the day. Brandon turned, and there stood Leonard Tate, the former construction worker he had thrown away like trash. Now, he was the community supervisor overseeing Brandon's service. Brandon's grip tightened on the broomstick, his face burning with a mixture of rage and humiliation. Leonard just smirked. Better start sweeping, Cole. And as Brandon Cole bent down and started cleaning the very city he once thought he owned, he realized this was only the beginning. The sun was relentless, beating down on the city streets as Brandon Cole pushed a broom across the pavement, sweat dripping from his forehead. The orange community service vest clung to his body, a stark reminder of his new reality. People walked past him, some barely sparing a glance, others openly staring, whispering, laughing. A few even took out their phones to snap pictures and record videos. Ain't that Brandon Cole? The billionaire? Damn, look at him now, sweeping streets like a janitor. Guess money couldn't buy his way out of this one, huh? Brandon's grip tightened around the broomstick, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to shove the camera phones away. But he couldn't, because standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with a smug expression, was Leonard Tate, the very man Brandon had discarded like trash. And now, he was the one in charge. Leonard walked over slowly, his boots crunching against the pavement. He stopped beside Brandon, looking him up and down. Not so fun when the roles are reversed, huh? He said, his voice laced with satisfaction. Brandon didn't respond. He just kept sweeping. Leonard chuckled. Yeah, that's what I thought. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Brandon could hear. You ain't special out here, Cole. You ain't in some fancy office barking orders. Out here, you're just another man doing what he's told. Brandon forced himself to stay silent. He knew, deep down, that any outburst, any slip-up, would only make this worse. But then Leonard took a step back and called out loudly, so the entire work crew could hear him. Hey fellas, we got a new recruit today. A real VIP. Y'all welcome Mr. Cole to the team. A few of the other workers laughed, some shook their heads, and one even whistled mockingly. Brandon gritted his teeth. Leonard turned back to him, smiling. Welcome to the bottom, Cole. The work was grueling. For hours, Brandon was forced to sweep streets, scrub graffiti off walls, and pick up trash under the watchful eyes of both the community service supervisors and the public, who seemed to relish in his misery. A man in a passing car rolled down his window and shouted, Yo, Cole! Need a loan? Before bursting into laughter. Another person, a woman with a Cole Industries tote bag, sneered as she walked past. Guess karma finally caught up with you, huh? Brandon bit his tongue, swallowing every ounce of rage, shame, and frustration that boiled inside him. But the worst part, it wasn't the hard labor. It wasn't the humiliation from strangers. It was the fact that he had no control. For the first time in his life, there was no assistant to call, no boardroom to retreat to, no expensive lawyer to fix things. He was nothing. And as the sun began to set and his body ached from exhaustion, Brandon finally realized something. This was only day one, and he had 999 more hours to go. By the time the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, Brandon's entire body ached. His hands, once accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar deals, were now covered in grime and blisters. His expensive cologne had long since faded, replaced by the overwhelming scent of sweat and asphalt. He had never felt more degraded in his life. As he tossed the last bag of trash into the sanitation truck, Leonard Tate clapped his hands together. "All right, that's enough for today. Let's pack it up." The rest of the community service crew muttered in relief, tossing their tools into the storage bins. Brandon, however, stayed frozen, gripping the edge of the trash can like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Leonard noticed. "Tired already, Cole," he taunted. "You only did one shift. Ain't like you built a damn house." Brandon's muscles burned, but his pride burned worse. He forced himself to stand upright, masking his exhaustion behind a blank stare. Leonard smirked. He could see right through him. "You better get used to this," he said, patting Brandon hard on the shoulder. "We got months ahead of us." Brandon stiffened under the touch, but didn't react. He had spent years ordering men like Leonard around, men who worked in his buildings, under his name, for his profit. Now he was one of them. Leonard motioned toward the van that would take them back to the processing center. "Get in, Cole. You ain't special no more." Brandon hesitated for a split second. Then without a word, he climbed in. And as the doors slammed shut behind him, the weight of his new reality finally hit him in full. Brandon thought nothing could be worse than community service. He was wrong. That night after his shift, he was taken back to Fulton County Jail, where he would be held until a federal prison transfer was scheduled. The moment he walked into general population, he knew he was in danger. The inmates' eyes locked onto him instantly, some with curiosity, some with recognition, and some with open hostility. Brandon wasn't just another convict. He was a billionaire in a cage full of men with nothing to lose. A large man with tattoos crawling up his neck leaned against the wall, smirking. Well, look what we got here." Brandon kept walking, refusing to engage. He had seen enough movies to know that showing fear was the fastest way to become a target. But then, another voice called out, this one cold and familiar. "Cole!" Brandon stopped in his tracks. A man stepped forward, emerging from the crowd of inmates. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running across his cheek. His prison uniform was loose, but the way he carried himself made it clear he was in charge. Brandon's stomach dropped. He knew that face. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man asked, tilting his head. Brandon swallowed hard. He did remember. Javier Ruiz, a former real estate investor who had once worked with Cole Industries, until Brandon had ruined him. Ruiz had been one of Brandon's competitors, and when their business dealings went south, Brandon had crushed him financially, forcing him into bankruptcy. And now? Ruiz wasn't just another inmate. He was one of the most feared men in the prison. He took a step forward, smiling, but there was no warmth behind it. "You stole from me, Cole. You took everything I had." Brandon's breath quickened, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Now?" Ruiz grinned. "You and me? We got all the time in the world to catch up." Brandon took a step back, but Ruiz's men surrounded him. There was no boardroom exit, no legal loophole, no bodyguards to protect him. For the first time in his life, Brandon Cole was truly defenseless. And he knew this was only the beginning. Brandon Cole had always been a man who thrived in control. Every business meeting, every negotiation, every power move he had ever made, it was always on his terms. But now he had no control. And the worst part, he was starting to realize it. The sun was unforgiving as he stood on the side of a busy street, his orange vest clinging to his sweat-drenched back. His hands, once soft and accustomed to luxury, were now rough and blistered from days of cleaning gutters, scrubbing sidewalks, and hauling trash bags. And looming over him, watching his every move with a satisfied smirk, was Leonard Tate. Faster, Cole, Leonard called out, crossing his arms. We ain't got all day. Brandon bit his tongue, pushing the heavy black garbage bag into the dumpster. The stench made his stomach churn, but he refused to show weakness. He had spent years looking down on men like Leonard. And now, Leonard was his boss. Brandon glanced up just in time to see a group of teenagers on the sidewalk, phones out, recording him. Yo, this is crazy, one of them laughed. This dude used to be a billionaire. Now he's picking up trash. Brandon felt his skin burn, not from the heat, but from the humiliation. He turned toward Leonard, his voice low, seething. They don't have to record everything. Leonard arched an eyebrow, then chuckled. Why? Embarrassed? Brandon's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Leonard took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough so only Brandon could hear. Now you know how it feels, huh? To be treated like garbage? Brandon exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to cling to some shred of dignity. But the truth was, Leonard was right. For the first time in his life, he was the one being discarded. At the end of the shift, Brandon trudged toward the prison transport van, his body aching from exhaustion. The workday had drained him, and the thought of spending another night in his cell, surrounded by men who wanted nothing more than to see him suffer, made him physically ill. But just as he reached the van, a guard stopped him. Cole, you got a visitor. Brandon blinked in surprise. A visitor? Who the hell would visit him? A few minutes later, he was escorted into the visitation room, where he found a familiar face waiting for him. Jessica Owens. Brandon stiffened, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by a surge of resentment. Jessica, sitting across from him in her crisp navy blue blazer, looked completely at ease, as if she had been expecting him to fall apart from the beginning. You look like hell, Cole, she said casually. Brandon forced a smirk, even though his body felt like collapsing. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Jessica shrugged. I won't lie. It's satisfying seeing you actually face consequences for once. Brandon leaned forward, his voice lowering. So, what? You came here to gloat? Jessica studied him for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she shook her head. Number, I came to see if you finally figured it out. Brandon narrowed his eyes. Figured what out? Jessica sighed, leaning back. That this isn't about punishment, Cole. It's about accountability. Brandon scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Please, don't act like this is some morality lesson. You wanted to ruin me, and congratulations, you did. Jessica's expression didn't change. You ruined yourself, she said simply. Brandon stayed silent, staring at her. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say, and that terrified him. Brandon sat frozen, staring across the metal visitation table at Jessica Owens. Her words echoed in his mind. You ruined yourself. For years, Brandon had convinced himself that power meant control, that money meant immunity, that he could always bend the world to his will. But now he was a felon in an orange vest, taking orders from a man he once discarded, being mocked by people who used to envy him. And worst of all, no one cared anymore. Jessica studied him carefully, as if waiting to see if he would finally break through his own delusions. But Brandon wasn't ready to admit anything. Not yet. He forced a hollow smirk, leaning back in his chair. Nice speech, counselor. You practiced that in the mirror? Jessica didn't flinch. No, she said, standing up and gathering her things. I just hoped you'd be smart enough to listen. Brandon's smirk twitched, but he kept it in place. Jessica walked toward the exit, but before she left, she turned back one last time. You still have time, Cole, she said, her voice softer than before. Not much, but some. You decide what you do with it. Then she was gone. Brandon stared at the empty chair across from him, the silence of the room pressing against his chest. He should have been angry, should have dismissed her words as self-righteous nonsense. But instead, for the first time in his life, Brandon Cole felt something he had never truly felt before. Doubt. That night, back in Fulton County Jail, Brandon lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. His body still ached from the day's labor, his hands raw, his legs sore. The distant sound of inmates shouting, laughing and fighting echoed through the halls. But he didn't care about any of that. All he could hear were Jessica's words, looping in his head like a bad dream. You ruined yourself. He wanted to deny it, to blame the system, to blame Judge Bennett, Jessica Owens, the jury, the media, hell, even Leonard Tate. But the longer he lay there, the harder it became to ignore the truth. No one had forced him to cut corners. No one had forced him to falsify reports. No one had forced him to ignore the people who worked for him. That had all been his choice. And now he was paying for it. For the first time, a cold, terrifying thought crept into his mind. Maybe he deserved this. The next morning, Brandon was woken up at 4:30 a.m. by the sound of banging metal bars. Up! Move it! The guard barked. Brandon groaned, his muscles protesting every movement as he sat up. The reality of his new routine was sinking in fast. By 5 a.m., he was in the prison mess hall, eating flavorless oatmeal from a plastic tray. By 6 a.m., he was back on the streets, wearing his orange vest, sweeping sidewalks and scrubbing graffiti off walls. And by 7:30 a.m., the ridicule had started again. Hey, Cole, need a job after this? My uncle's hiring janitors. Damn, man, you used to be rich. What happened? Guess money really don't buy everything, huh? Brandon kept his head down, gritting his teeth, forcing himself to ignore them. But then, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Hey, Cole! Brandon stopped sweeping, his grip tightening on the broom. Leonard Tate stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. You still think this is beneath you? Leonard asked. Brandon exhaled through his nose. What do you want, Tate? Leonard took a step closer. The smirk was gone. I want to know if you've learned anything. Brandon's jaw clenched. He wanted to snap back, to throw out some sarcastic remark, to act like he was still untouchable. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew the answer. He hadn't learned anything. Not yet. Leonard studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded to the broom in Brandon's hands. Keep sweeping, Cole. Then he walked away. Brandon stood there for a long time, his grip on the broom tightening. And for the first time, he didn't fight it. He just kept sweeping. Brandon Cole had spent his entire life believing that power meant freedom, that wealth erased consequences, that he was untouchable. But after weeks of prison and public humiliation, that belief had started to crumble. And today it shattered completely. It was early morning when Brandon was escorted from his cell to the prison yard, a concrete wasteland surrounded by towering fences and razor wire. The air was thick with tension, filled with the sounds of inmates talking in hushed voices, lifting weights, or watching the new arrivals with wary eyes. Brandon had kept to himself since being locked up, avoiding unnecessary conflict, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone decided to test him. And that time, it came today. As he walked across the yard, he felt eyes on him, and not just any eyes. Javier Ruiz, the man he had ruined, the man who now had every reason to make his life a living hell. Ruiz was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, his scarred face twisted in amusement as he watched Brandon approach. Yo, Cole! Brandon ignored him, keeping his head down. But that was a mistake, because within seconds, Ruiz was in front of him, blocking his path. You deaf man? I said your name. Brandon stopped, his heart pounding. Ruiz tilted his head, grinning. What? You ain't got nothing to say now? That's funny. You had a lot to say when you sent me to bankruptcy court. Brandon swallowed hard, but he forced himself to stand his ground. Look, Ruiz, Before he could finish, Ruiz grabbed him by the collar and shoved him back against the fence. The yard fell silent. Every inmate within earshot turned to watch. Brandon tensed, his hands curling into fists. Ruiz leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. You cost me everything, Cole. My business, my home, my family. Brandon's breathing was sharp, but he said nothing. Because what could he say? Ruiz chuckled. What's wrong? Ain't so fun when you're the one getting crushed, huh? Brandon's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. A guard. Break it up! Ruiz held his stare for another second, then released Brandon with a shove, stepping back with a smirk. We'll finish this later, Cole. Brandon exhaled slowly, his hands still clenched. He had just dodged a beating, but for how long? Leonard Tate had been watching the entire exchange from a distance, and for the first time, he saw something different in Brandon. Not anger, not arrogance, but fear, and maybe, just a maybe, understanding. Leonard didn't step in, not yet, because Brandon still had a lesson to learn. And some lessons, they had to be learned the hard way. Brandon spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet panic. He had been in tight spots before, but never like this. In business, he had always found a way to manipulate the boardroom, sway investors, crush competition. But in prison, there was no negotiating with men like Ruiz, no buying his way out, no second chances. He was trapped. And the worst part? Everyone knew it. That evening after dinner in the mess hall, Brandon was headed back to his cell when a voice called out, "Yo, Cole, hold up!" Brandon turned, already on edge. But the man walking toward him wasn't Ruiz. It was a younger inmate, probably in his early 20s, skinny but wiry, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Brandon had seen him before, hanging around with the lower-tier inmates, the ones who weren't part of any major gang but still knew how to survive. "Name's Jamal," the guy said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Word is, you got problems." Brandon said nothing. Jamal smirked. "You don't talk much, huh? That's cool. Let me cut to it. I know a guy who can get you protection." Brandon's stomach twisted. "Protection?" "Yeah," Jamal nodded. "Ruiz? He's gonna come for you again, man. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually, yeah." Brandon already knew that. Jamal leaned in slightly. "But see, in here, everything's got a price. You want to be left alone? You got to pay for it." Brandon frowned. "I don't have money in here." Jamal chuckled. "Nah, but you got connections. People on the outside, influence, favors." Brandon stiffened, because he understood exactly what that meant. "You're telling me to put myself in debt to someone." Jamal shrugged. "I'm telling you to survive." Brandon's chest felt tight. For the first time, he had to weigh a decision he never thought he'd have to make. He could owe someone in here, but that meant putting himself in a dangerous position. Or he could take his chances, alone. He exhaled slowly, then looked Jamal in the eye. "I'll think about it," Jamal smirked. "Just don't take too long." And with that, he walked away, leaving Brandon standing alone, caught between two terrible choices. The next morning, Brandon was back on the streets working his court-mandated community service shift. Leonard Tate, as always, was watching him. And today, he finally spoke. "You look like hell, Cole." Brandon didn't respond immediately. He just kept sweeping, kept pushing trash across the sidewalk. Leonard let the silence stretch, then took a step closer. "You get in trouble, didn't you?" Brandon exhaled sharply, gripping the broom tighter. "I can handle it," Leonard laughed. "Sure you can." Brandon's frustration finally boiled over. He turned, glaring at Leonard. "What do you want from me, huh? To admit I screwed up? To apologize? Would that make you feel better?" Leonard didn't flinch. "No," he said simply, "because you ain't ready to mean it yet." Brandon fell silent. Leonard tilted his head slightly. "You still think you're better than all of us." Brandon opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was true. Leonard studied him for another moment, then nodded toward the broom. "Keep sweeping, Cole." Brandon gritted his teeth, but this time he didn't argue. He just kept sweeping. Brandon Cole had once thought that nothing could break him, not the media scandals, not the courtroom humiliation, not even prison itself. But after months of laboring under the scorching Georgia sun, being mocked by the public, and facing the constant threat of prison violence, he was beginning to understand something. He had already been broken. The real question now was, could he rebuild himself? Brandon's time in prison had changed him, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had learned how to navigate the system, how to avoid conflict, and, most importantly, how to endure humiliation without lashing out. But even as he adapted, one fact loomed over him every day. His release date was approaching. 6 months into his 12-month sentence, he had been granted an early release hearing, a small glimmer of hope that he could leave this place sooner than expected. But nothing was guaranteed. Because the final decision, it rested in the hands of Judge Marcus Bennett, and Brandon knew better than anyone that the judge owed him nothing. The parole hearing begins. The day of the hearing arrived, and Brandon sat in a cold, windowless room, dressed in a beige prison jumpsuit, hands folded tightly in his lap. On one side of the room sat his defense attorney, this time not Whitmore, but a public defender assigned to his case. On the other side, Jessica Owens. She was here to challenge his early release. Brandon wasn't surprised. The door opened and Judge Bennett entered, taking his seat at the front of the room. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you've requested early release based on good behavior. This hearing will determine whether or not that request is granted." Brandon swallowed hard but nodded. Judge Bennett turned to Jessica. "Ms. Owens, you may proceed." Jessica stood, walking toward the table with measured steps. "Your Honor, while Mr. Cole has completed 6 months of his sentence without major infractions, that does not necessarily mean he is rehabilitated." She turned to face Brandon directly. "This is a man who built his career by cutting corners, exploiting workers, and believing himself to be above the law. His compliance with prison regulations does not erase the damage he has done." Brandon felt the weight of her words, but he didn't react. Because this time, he knew she was right. Judge Bennett nodded thoughtfully, then turned toward him. "Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say in response?" For the first time in his life, Brandon didn't have a rehearsed answer, a scripted defense, or a calculated excuse. He only had the truth. He took a slow breath, then spoke. "I deserve to be here." Jessica's expression didn't change, but he could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Brandon exhaled. "Everything Ms. Owens said is true. I spent years thinking that money gave me immunity, that I could do whatever I wanted and never face the consequences." His hands curled into fists on the table. "I was wrong." The room was silent. "Prison didn't teach me that," he continued. "It just forced me to live with it." Brandon glanced toward Jessica. "I can't undo what I've done. I can't fix the lives I ruined. But I can stop pretending like it wasn't my fault." Jessica said nothing. Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. Finally, he nodded. "We will reconvene in 1 week with a final decision." Gavel strike. The hearing was over. Brandon let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But as he stood to leave, Jessica spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "That was the first honest thing you've ever said." Brandon didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. And for the first time, that felt like enough. A week passed. Brandon spent each day waiting, not knowing if he would walk out of this place or serve the remainder of his sentence. And for the first time in his life, he had no control over what would happen next. On the morning of the hearing, he was escorted back into the cold, windowless room, his hands clasped in front of him as he took his seat. Judge Bennett sat at the front, his expression as unreadable as ever. Jessica Owens was there again, calm, composed, and watching him closely. And Brandon? For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for power. He was just waiting for the truth. Judge Bennett glanced down at the file in front of him before finally speaking. "Mr. Cole, this court has reviewed your conduct, your work during community service, and your statements from the previous hearing." Brandon braced himself. "Your request for early release is granted." Brandon exhaled sharply, his chest feeling lighter than it had in months. "But then," Judge Bennett continued, "however, your sentence is not over. You will complete the remaining 6 months under strict parole conditions, including continued community service and financial reparations to the victims of your fraudulent activities." Brandon nodded immediately. For the first time, he didn't argue. "Additionally," Judge Bennett added, his gaze sharp, "if at any point you violate these conditions, you will return to prison without appeal. Do you understand?" Brandon met his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Bennett studied him for another long moment. Then, for the first time since this trial began, he nodded. Not as a judge, but as a man who saw that maybe, just maybe, Brandon Cole had finally learned something. Court adjourned. That evening, Brandon stepped outside the walls of Fulton County Jail for the first time in 6 months. The city lights stretched before him. The air smelled different. He was free, but not unchained. Because this wasn't the end of his sentence. This was the beginning of his reckoning. As he stood there, a familiar voice called out, "Took you long enough, Cole." Brandon turned and saw Leonard Tate leaning against a car parked at the curb. Brandon exhaled slowly, then walked over. "What, you here to drive me to my next shift?" Leonard smirked. "You wish. But you got work to do, Cole. And for once, you actually know it." Brandon didn't argue, because for the first time in his life, he did. Brandon Cole had always believed that life was a game, and he had been the one holding the cards. But now, standing outside Fulton County Jail, staring at a city that no longer belonged to him, he realized something. This wasn't a game anymore. This was his last chance. Leonard Tate leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching Brandon with the same sharp, unreadable gaze he had worn in court. "Well, Cole, you just gonna stand there, or you gonna get to work?" Brandon let out a slow breath, then nodded. "Let's go." The ride was quiet. Atlanta passed by in a blur, the city looking both familiar and completely foreign. Brandon wasn't the same man who had once ruled these streets from the comfort of a high-rise office. Now, he was just another ex-con trying to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. Finally, Leonard pulled up outside a rundown community center. Brandon frowned. "This is where I'm working?" Leonard smirked. "You got a problem with that?" Brandon didn't answer. Because honestly, he wasn't sure. Inside, the community center was buzzing with life. Children raced down the halls, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Volunteers moved between rooms, carrying boxes of donated supplies. It was a world Brandon had never been a part of and never cared about. Until now. A woman in her 40s approached, her expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "So, this is the famous Brandon Cole." Brandon straightened, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "That depends," he said. "Am I famous for the right reasons?" The woman chuckled. "Not yet." Leonard stepped in. "Brandon, meet Sarah Henderson. She runs this place." Brandon extended a hand, but Sarah didn't take it immediately. Instead, she studied him. "You think you're ready for this?" she asked. Brandon hesitated, then nodded. "Guess we'll find out." Sarah finally shook his hand. "All right, Cole, let's see if you're serious." And just like that, his real work began. The first few days at the community center were harder than Brandon had expected. It wasn't the physical labor. He had already been broken down by months of prison and community service. It was the people. They knew who he was. Some were former employees of Cole Industries. Some were people who had lost their homes when his real estate deals went bad. And none of them trusted him. Not yet. One afternoon, while Brandon was stacking donated food in the storage room, he overheard two volunteers whispering outside. "I still don't get why he's here," court ordered. "Rich guy gets caught. Now he has to play nice for a few months. Bet he disappears the moment his parole is up." Brandon tightened his grip on the box he was holding. Because the worst part? They weren't wrong. At least, the old him would have done exactly that. But now, even he wasn't sure what came next. Later that week, Sarah pulled him aside. "We have a mentorship program for kids at risk of dropping out," she explained. "Some of them come from broken homes, bad neighborhoods. They need someone to keep them on track." Brandon frowned. "And you want me to help?" Sarah nodded. "You say you've changed. Let's see if that's true." Brandon almost laughed. Mentoring kids? Him? What did he have to offer? But Sarah wasn't giving him a choice. "Your first meeting is tomorrow morning." Brandon sighed. "Guess I'll be there." And just like that, he was forced into his most uncomfortable role yet. Not as a businessman, not as an inmate, but as a mentor. And he had no idea if he was up for it. The next morning, Brandon walked into one of the small classrooms in the center. Sitting at the back of the room, slouched in his chair, was a teenager in a hoodie. Brandon recognized him immediately. Jamal, Jamal, the same inmate who had offered him protection in prison, smirked. Well, well, look who's out. Brandon blinked, then turned to Sarah. This kid, Sarah shrugged. Got a problem? Brandon sighed. Guess not. Jamal leaned back in his chair, grinning. This is gonna be fun. And just like that, Brandon's final test truly began. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, painfully slowly, Brandon began earning back trust. Not with words, but with actions. He showed up every day, putting in the work. He mentored Jamal, helping him find opportunities beyond the streets. He learned from Leonard and Sarah, understanding the true cost of the damage he had caused. And one day, as he swept the floors of the community center without being asked, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it because it was right. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. One evening, as Brandon was locking up the center, Leonard walked up beside him. You still think this is temporary? Leonard asked. Brandon hesitated, looking out at the city skyline in the distance, the same city he had once ruled from above. Now, he was finally a part of it. He smirked, shaking his head. Nah, he said, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Leonard chuckled. Guess you finally figured it out. Brandon nodded, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about the past or what he had lost. He was thinking about what came next, and this time, he was ready to earn it.